Right now I'm working on republishing my first book, Colonialism in Sri Lanka, and an expanded version of it. And I guess that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, it is a very important time period in the history of Sri Lanka because even prior to British colonial rule, there had been Dutch colonial rule and Portuguese colonial rule in Sri Lanka. But after 1815, the whole island, including the Candian highlands, came under the rule of the British. And it is during this period that the British began to introduce a plantation economy and incorporate Sri Lanka into the expanding global capitalist economy. So it was a very crucial period in terms of transformation from a pre-colonial subsistence economy to becoming a dependent colonial export economy. So I think historically it's very interesting, but it also created the structures that have been continued, which shaped subsequent political, economic, as well as cultural developments on the island. I mean, this is just a case study of Sri Lanka. Parallel developments took place in colonial countries around the world. Well, it is a very specialized case study of the Sri Lankan experience and the Candian highlands, but I also look at the broader patterns, particularly in the last theoretical chapters, at the methods that were used in this transformation of pre-existing agricultural systems into monocultural plantation economy and its impact on local subsistence and lifestyles and the political structures that were created to maintain this new systems of production. And so there are comparable developments around the world because the colonial transformation was a global one, and it continues today, of course, taking different forms and shapes. Well, in the 19th century, you see the creation of a monocultural plantation economy and the production for export rather than subsistence. So it changes local economic patterns, and local people become dependent on the import of food because their labor and resources are used to produce export. In the case of Sri Lanka, that I look at what is called the coffee period, which was subsequently followed by the tea period, and tea continues to be a major export from Sri Lanka. These processes of land expropriation and resistance to them, took place in many other parts of the world, and they continue to date. So, just like the period of 1833 to 1886 was a pivotal period in the transformation from subsistence production to export production and the introduction of and establishment of a colonial economy, Sri Lanka is again at a pivotal point with a lot of external powers interested in Sri Lanka for both economic and political reasons. Because Sri Lanka is strategically located and has some very fine natural ports, like the port of Trincomalee, which is on the eastern coast, there was always rivalry among different external powers to get control over Trincomalee, and that continues. And then also the port in Colombo, which is also a very strategically located and important seaport in the east-west trade routes, and a also further south in Hambantota, which is now has been leased to the Chinese for 99 years. And so China, India, and the US are all interested in control over the ports and access to Sri Lanka. The United States is particularly interested in having access to ports and infrastructure in Sri Lanka. Also to have access for private companies to come and develop the land and the resources. There's something called the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact that the US is trying to sign with Sri Lanka, which would lead to the privatization of state-owned lands by providing local people access to them, and eventually that giving them access to sell those lands once it passes from the state to private holders. So it has become very controversial, and there is a lot of concern that this is a new form of expropriation of local land for the use of multinational corporations. The book really doesn't even get into party politics so much, but tries to transcend that polarization and look at the larger political economic context and the environmental and sovereignty issues facing all of Sri Lanka. So it's really a much more I would say a kind of a transcendent perspective that is looking at the issues of domination versus partnership from a very broad lens, but at the same time looking at the specific case of Sri Lanka, of the external interventions and the use of the attempt to control local resources and people to satisfy external interests, what colonialism is about. If local people are not really paying attention to that, they can lose control over their own resources and they can become sort of servile population. And that can happen easily even under neocolonialism. With neocolonialism and today, because at least in name, a country like Sri Lanka is considered independent, there is a tendency to sort of overlook what is actually happening in terms of control over resources by people, because they don't realize what is actually happening. And also it's not sort of widely reported. And as in many other places, people are sort of dealing with their day-to-day realities, and these are seen as political issues without much recognition how really it does affect everyone, because it is the heritage of all the people of the country, these resources. Sri Lanka gained political independence from British in 1948. And this last chapter sort of looks at some current developments. So there were several decades where there were external attempts to control economically and politically, but there was also local resistance. There were periods when the plantations were nationalized, and there were sort of attempts to develop local industries and diversify agriculture, have more local autonomy, both economically and politically. And there were attempts, and this happened not just in Sri Lanka, but in other parts of what was called the Third World or ex-colonial countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And sometimes those efforts succeeded and other times they didn't. But the powerful countries like the United States, especially during the Cold War, was always trying to dissuade countries from going on their separate paths, but be aligned with itself, which meant, with the capitalist model of development. And the Soviet Union tried to do that also, to get countries to join its bloc. So it was very difficult for the small countries to maintain autonomous models of development, although they did try. There was a talk of African socialism in many African countries. And what was very important is the non-alignment movement, which was championed by Prime Minister Nehru of India, Nkrumah of Ghana, as well as Sri Lankan prime ministers, to try to stay away from this Cold War struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of support for that. And now again, it's interesting that there is a resurgent interest in non-alignment, because both the United States and China are vying for power over Sri Lanka, and there are many groups saying we don't want to be involved in this new geopolitical struggle. We want to maintain our independence. So I think more people speaking out on behalf of non-alignment is an important thing. I think it's significant given that Sri Lanka could get caught in this new superpower struggle, and also because there is hardly anything about this in the international media. I mean, there are people in Sri Lanka writing about it and very concerned about these issues, but internationally, there is hardly anything. So that's why I think this is important, because it's based on research and evidence, and just raising issues. There are certainly no clear-cut answers, and also these are developments that are evolving, and we don't know which direction they will go, but I think it is really important to pay attention to them, and especially for the Sri Lankan people who don't want to get caught in a superpower struggle, or for that struggle to get fought on their soil when, that's not to their interest. I think that policymakers, both Sri Lankan and Westerners and international policymakers, should pay attention to these kinds of studies and understand the trajectory of history and why some people are in resistance, and also that these countries and these people are not just there for exploitation by external powers and interests, that these are countries with very rich historical traditions and people with pride in their own land and culture and their history. And these are not just commodities to be sold to the highest bidder and for them to use whatever they want. This is the heritage of the people of those countries. And I think that this applies globally. And this has been one of the problems with globalization, because ethical, social, environmental criteria are not taken into account in global economic expansion and the integration of different parts of the world into this one world economy, that it's a much more complex process, which is not to say that there should be no form of globalization or any form of sort of export-import trade. But I think the environmental concerns of sovereignty, social justice, peace, so on and so forth, have to be factored into decision making. So that's also why, while this is a sort of a scholarly study, that it has broader implications in terms of democracy, sovereignty, and justice.